welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for coming. Once again, as you continue to come in, please feel free to add your name, class year, and pronouns into the chat so we can get to know each other both, through our images and also on the chat digitally. Before we begin today, we do want to let you know that this session is being recorded and it will be shared with other alumni who cannot attend today. And we're also recording this because we want to preserve this conversation in this moment in time for current and future Williams students through a project that we are working on with the Davis Center.
Thank you again for being here. Before we begin, I wanted to say special thank you to Ashley and Michael for holding down the fort. Technologically speaking, I am not a Zoom aficionado, so I thank them every single moment of every day that they help us with these things. And also thank you to QSU for collaborating with us for what we hope is a unique and hopefully inspirational event.
So I'm sure that many of you got your Williams People magazine this week. And Kate Ramsdell, our president, wrote a beautiful note that I hope we can all take to heart as we begin this event. I want to share just a portion of that with you today to kind of get us started and get us thinking about the impact of this event and events like this. She wrote, quote, "I imagine we all began our Williams experiences believing we would thrive. Many of us felt the sense of support, belonging, and connection that the Bicentennial celebrates. Yet, some of us encountered an environment that did not provide us with all that we needed to be whole. The work of the Society of Alumni is to make good on the promise of the college to be an inclusive community. As we seek to offer reconciliation, to celebrate, and to grow, we ask that you share your story. The Williams stories we carry with us in all their joy, pain, and pride will help us to cultivate, nurture, and propagate the idea that there will forever be a place for you. Failures, flaws, inflexible hips, and all in the Williams College Society of Alumni," end quote. You're going to need to read the full article to understand the hips reference. But we are indeed here to answer that call and tell our stories today.
So just to give you a little bit of context about this event specifically, I found out recently that Middlebury College began their process of creating an LGBTQ alumni organization in 2017. And they're still working to figure out what that's going to look like for their college. So just imagine, the generations of students and alumni who may not even have an inkling of the history that existed before them. And I personally really don't care what other institutions do. Like, I wasn't there, so whatever. But I just wanted us to note that there seems to be something different in the water of the Hoosick River and the Purple Valley, because, we have been so fortunate, whether or not the world was ready for us, to have alums who have been working hard to make Williams a more inclusive place. And I am so very grateful for that. As BiGLATA, we owe a lot of the legacy of this group to the generosity of spirit of the alums of the 60s and 70s, when we were a nascent organization and during a time when the country was going through a lot of change. Also, as we begin this conversation, we need to remember that we have lost some of these same leaders and friends along the way, some to natural causes, to accidents, to time, and some, like John Attridge, who was instrumental in helping to set up BiGLATA, to HIV/AIDS related complications. Hopefully there will be a way to honor those that we've lost to HIV/AIDS and its impact on our community. But today we are talking about the Bicentennial. And the Bicentennial theme is "There's a Place for You," and this month's theme is support. And the funny thing about the past is that it's complex. We can revere it, and we can also have complicated emotions about how it all went down. Now, so sorry, I lost my place. This series was created to further include our stories into the history of Williams College. And in recalling, we can acknowledge the shortcomings in the history of the college, the Society of Alumni, and even the world. But we can also hope that this series will be about learning and connecting intergenerationally as Ephs, documenting our evolution, taking some lessons from the past and fortifying the college so that the current students can thrive and hopefully question whether they belong a little bit less.
Yes, and it sounds like it's a big task, right? But we're here for it. And so today we want to welcome a panelist of alumni from the 60s and 70s. We are going to ask them a few questions, give them a chance to introduce themselves, go into some pre-circulated sort of Q&A, and then we're going to open it up to some questions from you all. And so please feel free, as questions come to mind as you're listening to their answers and their reflections, to add your questions in the chat. You can write a Q if you want in front of it. You can just sort of just type it right in. And you can, if you want to ask anything anonymously, feel free to send your question directly to the person entitled questions. So the person that says questions, that's the name. You can send them a direct message and they will capture those questions and we will try to incorporate them in our conversation. And so let's begin. Let's get to it. Let's meet the people that are here, that we're here to talk to today. And so we're going to actually start off our conversation with Michael Dively, class of 1961, public servant and philanthropist. And I want to give him, we sent bios out, right, as part of this event. And so you can kind of incorporate that a little bit into the answer to this first question that we're going to ask you. We're going to kick it off with, which is, I wanted to ask Michael, if you would picture what you thought about Williams before you got to campus, before you got to Williams. How did your experience at Williams match up with your expectations?
Well, I think it's important to realize when you identify the class I'm in, that if it were not for COVID, my class would be returning in a month for our 60th reunion. So the world and the country and I have changed a lot in those 60 years. To simply answer your question, there was no internet, there was no information. I was reflecting the other day, and I think the first time I had a conversation with someone, not the first time I had sex, but the first time I had conversation with a man about being gay was probably well into my early 40s, maybe late 30s. I came to Williams. Williams was 1,200 men, almost all white, actually mostly Protestant. There were no women. And I, to this day, know of only 2 members of my class of 300 who were gay that came out in our 50th reunion booklet. So if there's any of you watching that know people in the class of 61 who are gay, I'd love to hear from them. So my expectations for Williams were shaped on the fact that I came from Shaker Heights, Ohio, and that there were, I think, something like 4 or 5 of the class ahead of me in my country day school who had gone to Williams. I had visited Williams. And when I arrived, I found that the workload was what I expected. And the shift was, the academic shift and the social shift was not very significant. And I really never explored my sexuality when I was at Williams. I dated a little bit, but very little. and spent most of my time swimming, which meant that I had chlorinated eyes most of the time. But I really didn't have, Williams exceeded my expectations, but my expectations were based on knowing people who had been here in the preceding couple of classes. Hopefully that answers the question, but it was a wholly different time. I couldn't find out if I'd really wanted to. I don't know how I would have gone to find out about what it was that I was feeling for boys.
Right, right. And I mean, that makes a great deal of sense. And I think today, one of the big kind of lenses that we have to put on is sort of the context of the times, right? That is something that we need to constantly kind of come back to in our ideas, I think, of higher education and going to college and, you know, the connections and the amount of information that was available even.
And it's important to know that 1961 was a turning point at Williams, because our president then, James Finney Baxter, for whom Baxter Hall, when it was there, was named, was retiring after 20 some years. And it was also the last, well, it was the Eisenhower years. It was a very tranquil, quiet period. I graduated just after John F. Kennedy was inaugurated as president. But it was a very quiet time. McCarthy and the McCarthy era was just dying out. It had affected several faculty members just before I arrived, and there was still that feeling on campus that of tenseness. So it was, you're right, it was a very different time. It was a different student body, but by the time Stephen arrived, because it was my year, Gargoyle, our year, began a little bit of a rumbling that was picked up by the Grinnell Committee the following year, which led to the termination of the fraternities, and then shortly thereafter, the becoming co-ed. So all of those changes were just beginning to bubble up, but not very visibly when I was there.
Yeah, which brings us to our next panelist, Stephen Rosenbaum, former pediatrician, current EC member, also one of the alums who helped found BiGLATA. Welcome. So same question to you. Picture what you thought before attending Williams. You know, I know that you came from just down the street, but but how did your experience at Williams match up to your expectations?
So I think Williams was probably what I first thought colleges looked like. Having driven to Williamstown many times while I was growing up, it just looked like the place I would want to go to school. I also probably thought of Harvard that way. Obviously, Harvard had a much larger reputation, and I truly didn't realize what Williams' reputation was until I got there. But they both looked similar. They both had great looking buildings. And at that point in my life, I really wasn't interested in going too far away to school. So I applied early decision, didn't get in, and got in, you know, through the regular channels. I remember driving up there the first day. My parents were driving me off. I also have to say I was the first person in my respective family to have gone to college. My dad didn't go to college. He had his own business. My mother went to nursing school briefly, but I was the first one to go to college. And I was so proud to be there and that I was going to be on my own and I wouldn't need them for anything. And literally, as soon as they left, I realized I had forgotten my toilet kit. So, not exactly a very important thing, but embarrassedly, I had to call them and say, I needed this. You know, I was that incapable of realizing I could walk to a pharmacy, walk down to Spring Street and get whatever I needed. But anyway, my parents came back with it. So I guess when I got there, and once I started classes, and certainly once I got my first paper back, I realized that even though I had done very well in high school, there were a lot of people in my classes who were as smart as I was, and perhaps even smarter. And it was a real awakening for me how hard I was going to have to work, and just figuring out what all that was about. And also, I'm Jewish, and I remember it was probably the High Holy Days started just after we began classes. And I thought, God, this is going to be the first year I am not going to be able to go to services. And I wondered if I was somehow going to be struck down dead by God with a thunderbolt because I wasn't going to services. These were, I guess, the sort of things I thought about then. In terms of thinking about whether I was gay, I don't even know that that crossed my mind at that point, or that I even knew what to call it. I guess I knew that I felt different somehow, but what that different actually meant, I don't think I really knew. And I was probably much more concerned with just getting my work done, making sure I did well, and just kind of keeping my head above that water was sufficient. I obviously went on mixers with everybody, but again, it was like, you know, I was probably more interested in what the women were wearing than who they were. And I remember a mixer at Vassar, and one of the girls I talked to, what I liked most about her was the shoes she was wearing. And I can still remember what they look like to this day. And that is like 51 years later. So I guess that's where my head was then. I had a good friend from high school who went to Smith. I was friendly with her and with her roommates. But it was the same thing. I don't know that I knew then who I was. And I have moments still when I'm not 100% sure of that.
Thank you, Stephen. I appreciate it. We've the three of us have been able to get to know each other a little bit more during being part of the BiGLATA executive committee, and so I love all these sort of anecdotes and sort of stories that you share with us. And so I would like to bring in now Rives Kistler from the class of 1971 to we're getting on to the next decade. And so you're going to introduce us into that that first year. And so Rives is a former justice of the Oregon Supreme Court. He's familiar with being a first in many ways in your field and in that particular area. So I wonder, again, the same question, what did you picture Williams to be, right? What were your expectations? And ultimately, was your experience at Williams what you expected? Did those match up, the expectations and the experience?
So for me, I didn't have very many expectations. I grew up in the South in a small town, went to a public high school. I had visited Williams once before I went there, and I remember thinking everybody was really friendly. They were nice. You could have women in your rooms, which was something you couldn't do in any Southern college I went to, which turned out not to be something that mattered for me. And you could drink, and that was all. Those were all kind of vaguely exciting to me. So I came to Williams because I wanted to go to someplace different, someplace. I didn't want to go to school in the South where I'd grown up. I thought I wanted to have a different kind of experience. And for me, what I found when I got to Williams was that it was quite a different experience. I wasn't used to people from different parts of the country necessarily. It was sort of a shock to try to figure out, how did I fit in? How would I get along with people? I remember going into my calculus class the first day, and they asked how many of you had calculus in high school. Everybody raised their hand except for two of us. So I sort of had a feeling of trying to sort of catch up to make sure I stayed on top of things, trying to figure out kind of where I fit and who my friends were. And I think for me, that probably took me a couple of years to sort of find my own level of the people whom I enjoyed being with, whom I felt close to. And in terms of orientation, I think I'm probably like Stephen. The thought really hadn't crossed my mind too much. It was something vague in the back of my mind, but nothing that was sort of at the front. Um, I went on a couple of mixers. I have to confess, I didn't look at people's shoes, although I think that would be a great thing. But it was, and I just sort of felt like, oh, I don't quite fit in this whole framework. And again, it took me a while to find the people with whom I did feel that I had a fit with. And then in terms of just the experience academically, it was, I think, everything I could ask for. It was challenging. I learned a lot. I grew. All those things were important to me. It just took me a while to find out where I felt I belonged.
Mm-hmm.
This is this is so true. Everything happens in its own time, which I think if we unfortunately we have to move on to Dan Pinello, but I think a great juxtaposition is our next panelist. I'm Dan Pinello, urban historian, and one of the author of the article that we've been sharing so multiple times as in the lead up to this event. So Dan. If you're here. Yes, there we go. So just picturing what you thought about before you attended Williams, how did your experience at Williams match up to your expectations?
Well, I should share with you where I was coming from. Born and raised in Colorado into a desperately poor and dysfunctional family, I had no expectations except going to Williams was going to improve my life dramatically. My mother had worked as a domestic for wealthy families, one of whom was a Dr. Giles Toll, class of 1950 at Williams. She cleaned his house and I mowed his lawn during the summer. And so I applied to the college of which he was a product, thinking that was a tremendous opportunity for me. And I was a full scholarship student at Williams. I had never, and I by the way, I applied to other colleges, all of which were at least 2,000 miles away from Colorado, because the one thing I knew instinctively is I had to escape. And Williams was my salvation. Williams saved me in so many ways. And then fast forwarding to my senior year when I came out publicly, coming from my background as I did provided me the leeway to do so, to come out, because I had nothing to lose. Many of my classmates had come from well-established families with looking forward to potential inheritances or having other approval from parents or whatever. And if they had come out in a similar way, they might have risked all of that. I had the liberty of not having to worry about that kind of thing. And Williams just was, again, my salvation. I blossomed and grew. One minor example of how different life for me was at Williams compared to prior is that during my freshman year in the fall of 1968, and having the freshman dining hall at Baxter, the freshman dining room available to me at Baxter Hall, that was the first time I reliably had 3 meals available to me in my lifetime. So Williams was a revelation in every way. And again, it was a salvation. So I am very grateful to the school.
That's amazing. Thank you, Dan, for sharing that. I think, it's just understanding the backgrounds, like you said, we all need to have that context, right? This context for who we are as an organization. And we need to know each individual's context in order to understand who we are as an organization, right, or as an institution. And so that's what we're doing today. So I appreciate that so much. Thank you for sharing that. And one of, I'd love to transition us also into our next panelist, Lisa Capaldini, class of 78. Given that, again, we're talking about context, we're talking about first, and we're talking about an entirely different experience. Someone who identifies, right, differently than the rest of our panelists so far. And so our first voice, Lisa Capaldini, is a pioneering leader in treating AIDS patients in San Francisco. And she also did kind of the history thing. I was pre-med as well, try to balance both. I think you did a better job of it than I did. But Lisa, if you would share with us, again, what were your expectations at Williams? And, what was your experience, and was there overlap with those two?
When I visited Williams, I stayed with 4 amazing women who lived in a row house. And they were just amazing because they were authentic and smart and no nonsense. And I thought, if this is what the school is about, I want to come here. And I also was very happy that I had the History of Ideas department, because I knew I'd have to take a lot of pre-med courses and didn't want to drown in that. My first recollection of Williams, my first event, was just the opposite. It was arriving in the freshman quad. I was in Sage D, I believe. And for our freshman day orientation, there was a beer keg event in the freshman quad, which seemed heavily populated by a lot of preppies who knew each other. Of course, I didn't. And so at the very beginning, I felt, wow, this isn't what I expected. And I was very alienated and intimidated by it. I didn't know that world. So I more or less happily disappeared into my studies. I had 2 great dorm mates, both of whom came from public school, so that was helpful. And with regard to the sexuality stuff, I was absolutely happily oblivious. I remember in high school just not understanding why all the girls were acting stupid around the boys. And I would go play tennis with this guy, and my mother would say, you should dress up for your date. And I said, this isn't a date, we're just going to go play tennis. So I didn't realize I was gay until someone a year behind me named Lucy Bledsoe showed up in my room. And it was a really rainy night. It was a dark and stormy night. And I was trying to figure out why in the world did she schlep down there. And she was sort of huddled in the corner of my room and basically told me not only that she was gay, but that she was partners with her partner, who I knew quite well as well. So I had this very schizo experience. Part of me thought, well, let's see, 10% of people are gay and you have 20 friends, so those are your 2 gay friends. Very left brain. And then the other part of me was like, oh my God, what does this mean? And eventually that segued into me understanding who I was. So thank you, Lucy. I would say the thing that really struck me, and I hope this doesn't sound misanthropic to say, was it was very clear at Williams, and it's been clear in the rest of my life, that there is a very wide gap between being book smart and being ethical, between getting great grades and being able to say snappy, witty things, and being able to stand up and do the right thing. And so while I was absolutely thrilled with the education I got at Williams, I did feel like there was a part of life we never really addressed, things like suffering and inequality. And as best I can tell from talking to people who've gone to Williams much later than me, that stuff is more on the table now.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see these conversations change over time. What I think is really great is we have the other side of that story that you just told here today. So Lucy, welcome again. Same question. Sorry, author and author of note. That's how I will introduce you. So same question to you. Picture what you thought before attending Williams. How did your experience match up with your expectations?
Well, since Lisa's already started the embarrassing stories about myself, I'll just continue them. My expectations totally were different from what happened. I grew up in Portland, Oregon. I went to public school. I wanted to go away really far. I didn't know why I wanted to go away really far, but I wanted to go all the way to the East Coast. My mom had told wonderful stories about the East Coast. I heard Williams had a incredible outdoors program, and I was really outdoorsy. And so it's the only school I applied to. I got in, wait, the embarrassing part. I forgot to tell the embarrassing part. So I spent my junior and senior year in high school, one of my big activities was getting the Portland Public Schools in compliance with Title IX. We had very few sports programs for girls, and I very much wanted to play basketball, which is actually how I met Lisa at Williams. So I started speaking to the school board and the state legislature, trying to get Oregon in compliance with Title IX, which had just been passed a couple of years prior. And the boys basketball coach at my high school he saw me as an enemy and was very angered by this because they'd have to share gym time if they gave the girls a team. So that's a whole nother story, but the part I want to tell now is he I had a very close friend on the boys basketball team, and this coach told the whole basketball team that I was a lesbian as part of his attack on me. For some reason, this didn't upset me that much, so that should have been a clue right there. But so he knew I was a lesbian. I didn't yet know it. The other embarrassing part is the other thing I liked about Williams, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to admit it, is it was 2 to 1 men to women at that point. And I thought, this will take care of my problem. You know, I just haven't met there's going to be so many men at Williams. I also thought when I got to college, they'd be like really mature men, like, you know, ones I'd really want to be with. So off I go to Williams. Within, I don't know, 3 months or something, I fell madly in love with another girl/woman who luckily was in love with me too. I busted out of the closet. By the spring, we had started what we thought at the time was the first student gay organization. I'm just now learning that maybe Dan started one a few years before us, which is interesting. That so wonderfully you're doing this panel, because we don't know our own history because no one tells it.
Until now.
Yes. So it was a wild ride at that point, but I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah. So let's hear about this. So Dan, what was this organization that happened? I mean, obviously you wrote this article, which I've read like 500 times now, because it was a story to me when I was at Williams. Like I'd heard that once upon a time there was someone named Dan Pinello who like came out in the Williams Record, and it was, I have to say, like such a comfort to know that there was a history of LGBTQ people at Williams. But, you know, I didn't get the full story at the time.
Well, it's a long story. I'll just give some of the highlights. During my senior year, I came out in October in the Williams Advocate. And then as a follow-up to that, I invited 3 members of the Gay Activist Alliance of New York to come to Williamstown to give a public talk about gay rights activism. And so they were sometime in November and spoke in the auditorium at Jessup Hall one evening, which was overflowing. It was just filled. And after that public presentation was over, I said, those of us who would like to reconvene to talk about forming a group could meet at a room in Griffin Hall. And about 8 or 10 people showed up. And so thereafter, we met periodically in a very informal way. And so that was the first that I'm aware of LGBT, gay and lesbian, was gay group. I don't know if there were any women at that time at the college, which only lasted for as long as I remained there because no one was willing to take on the public face that I offered.
Wow.
So it was a very informal group, but it did meet periodically every month or so.
That's okay. So, and then there's the second part. So then we started on Lucy kind of and the organization that you were talking about. So would you mind sort of sharing that a little bit with us? And then we can kind of see, I'm really curious to kind of see the evolution, or is it a reiteration? Yeah, Dan.
I can add something more.
Okay.
John Attridge, whom Mijan referred to earlier, was the class of 1976. And in his senior year, he somehow discovered my coming out article. He contacted me in New York City and invited me back to speak to his group as an alumnus, which was then active in at least 1976. And I did so. I returned to Williamstown. And in fact, that happened periodically. My coming out article kept being rediscovered. I keep making pilgrimages back to Williamstown to nascent and evolving groups as they occurred on campus. So there was another one, at least as of 1976, that I'm personally aware of.
Yeah,
And that John had been an organizer of.
Yeah, it's a very similar story, I believe, Lucy, because they, I think you'd know more than I would, but I believe that there was a speaker that came to campus, and then there was a similar founding of a group.
Yeah, it was very similar. Elaine Noble, who was the only lesbian member of Congress at the time, came to speak. And afterwards, a woman who identified herself as straight, a student, stood up and said, we need a group. Anyone who wants to form this group, stay after the speaker. So me and my partner and Michael Levine, who I know is listening in today, and a couple of us just hung out, and sort of everybody's like, oh, I'm just sort of here. I'm not really staying for the meeting. Everybody's sort of not meeting eyes. But we did stay, and we formed a group, and we joked about it a lot because our first couple meet, and there was one professor too, and I don't know if she was out, so I won't say her name, but for a while we met in her apartment. But before that, we met in the women's studies had a tiny, tiny office that was about the size of a closet. So we said we met in a closet, and we had our first meetings. As it happened, there was a young woman from my hometown of Portland, Oregon, who, when we started publishing the Lavender Albatross, she infiltrated the group by posing as queer. And outed me the summer of my freshman year to my entire hometown of Portland, Oregon. So it was, in retrospect, a really good way to come out, because just tearing the Band-Aid off really fast, and I didn't have to do it myself, but it was pretty intense. There's some pretty intense stuff happened those years.
Yeah, I think I personally feel like there's nothing worse than outing someone. That is just like the ultimate violation of someone's personal privacy and should never happen, ever. Unfortunately, it does, but that is not great. But no, but that it's just so crazy to see that, like, there was this want to start a group, and you know, that you know, generations of students are really just like, no, like, we want to do this, and we're gonna do this here. I'm wondering, because you also ended up leaving campus. What was that like? Because you were there for 2 years, I believe, and then you relocated to a different school.
Yeah, those were a hard 2 years for me. Coming from Portland, Oregon, I felt like culturally it was just so different. The East Coast, coming from public school, most of the kids there had been in private school. There's just a lot, but I think as years go by, it's more just the sort of my personal coming out and how difficult that time was had more to do with it than Williams, actually. Often I've wished that I had gone back for my second 2 years, but I went to Berkeley. My girlfriend and I had intended to move to California together. We literally took a Greyhound bus to the Bay Area, went to the Castro looking for gay people. They sent us to a women's bar. We stayed at the YMCA. We had this incredible few days, and we were gonna move there together. And then she was graduating. She's 2 years older than me. She was graduating and at the last minute got a job in New York City instead. So it was fine. We were way too young to be, you know, moving somewhere together, and we've remained very, very close friends ever since. So we never really broke up. We just moved on. But I went ahead and went to California, where we were supposed to be going together. And I transferred to Berkeley, and I absolutely loved it. There's a big, wonderful, flourishing queer community there, and I was very much a part of it, and it was a good fit for me.
That's awesome. You know, something that I'm kind of hearing as everyone is telling their story is just like, if you sort of did or didn't see yourself in your environment, it became easier or more difficult, right, to kind of thrive or survive, right? Some of it was like survival. If I didn't see anything, I had nothing to hold on to. It was like, I'm kind of just floating. If you found your people or some people, or whether that was adults or peers, then you could feel a little bit more like you were breathing, a little more open, and like you could maybe find, you know, you could thrive at Williams. And so, you know, I'm wondering, and, you know, this Lucy or our other panelists as well, you know, representation is really important. How do you feel like that affected your, you know, your time at Williams? I'm hearing a lot of different, like, first gen, for example. I'm hearing a diverse socioeconomic, right, status. I'm hearing different, you know, all of that. So I wonder if you all can speak to that. How did your context and seeing yourself or not at Williams in other students or faculty, how did that impact your time at Williams? And I kind of threw that out to anyone, but I don't know if anyone has this, because I know I was like, I'm throwing it out.
All right, I'll jump in.
So I would say my time at Williams really was pretty positive. Whether or not, I mean, what I was doing sexually or not really didn't seem to make a difference. I just knew I wanted to get through there. I knew I wanted to go to medical school. I knew all of that needed to be done, and that was my primary focus. I also realized, because I was a history major, and even more particularly an American civilization major, which they don't even have anymore, I knew I wanted to get everything I could out of my Williams experience that I knew once I went to medical school was never going to happen again. And I'm so glad I did. The pre-med advisor at Williams was the head of the chemistry department. And I remember him telling me that I was going to be absolutely on the defensive everywhere I applied to medical school because I wasn't a science major. Well, it turned out I was the first one in my class to get in anywhere. So that was irrelevant. So I went off to UVA. Again, I really do seem to be taken by schools that are attractive. I like things that are attractive. Why not? And I had done my thesis on Southern literature. So going down to Charlottesville was an easy fit. It was beautiful. A couple of my classmates went there as well. I knew some people who had gone there, and it was a good fit. But I realized again, while I was there, that I was still, at that point, I was a Northerner in a Southern school, even though Charlottesville, Virginia is not really very far south, but it was south enough for me. And it was, right. And I liked that aspect of it. But, you know, there were a handful of women in my class. When I was at Williams, that was the first half a semester that there were a bunch of Vassar students there. Mm-hmm. So I had already gotten used to that. And the biggest thing in my first year class in medical school was the secretary of the medical school always was given the women grief because their skirts were too short. But, you know, it's like the Northerners were troublemakers, and the Southern guys who had all gone to Southern schools were just very polite. But it was another eye-opening time for me because I felt different there. Again, because I still didn't know that I was gay, but I still knew something was not the same about me as my classmates. So it took me longer to find that out. So I had another two years to go before I really knew that something was afoot that I had to come to terms with.
And I know that Rives, you had mentioned that you came out later as well, and also Michael. What was that journey like, depending on like when it happened in your life? Because it didn't occur at Williams, but you still went through that journey personally.
Michael, you want to go first?
Well, my journey ended up with my getting married. It ended up with my serving 6 years in the legislature in Michigan, and then a couple years in the executive branch, and then getting married. And a couple years into my marriage, a dear friend of mine who had been an usher in my wedding and also helped manage my first campaign had lunch with me, and I can still remember. And he was gay, although at that point, it turned out that of my 6 ushers, 4 of them were gay, but they weren't at that point. I guess that said something, but it didn't say anything.
You're finding them all.
Yes,
Yeah.
Seems to
I was
be.
able to identify them, but they weren't. But in the middle of lunch, he said, he said, my rule of thumb sort of is that if you're 17 or 18 or 19 and you think you're gay, it's okay to explore. But he said, if you're 20 or 21 or older, at that point I was 42, he said, you're asking yourself the wrong question. It's, when will you accept the fact that you're gay? And I still remember that lunch. And I remember that the next day I told my wife that we needed to get a divorce. And she negotiated with me and said she didn't want to, but we ended up getting a divorce. It was very amicable. We didn't have any children. And I saw her just recently for lunch when she was down in Florida. So we've stayed friends 50 years later. So it was a long journey that culminated very quickly, but it was the fact that I kept thinking that I was gay. I was kept being a good lawyer. I kept asking myself, am I gay or not? I went to Key West to explore that and stayed for a month, and then came back and proposed to my then-to-be wife because I decided I wasn't gay. Williams actually, in 4 years, probably didn't touch any of my sexuality. And Williams in those days was, like Steve and I majored in what was then called American Studies. We had no courses on Africa. We had no courses on South America. But it was what was happening, and the world was much different.
It was.
And it changed very abruptly. Rives?
So I figured out by the time I was a junior that I was gay. It was apparent to me. My problem wasn't whether I was gay or not, it was trying to figure out who else was gay. And I had no idea who anybody else in the campus was gay. I didn't know. Stephen and I were both in Garfield House. I don't remember him. He said he wasn't there that much. Dan actually joined in Garfield House also.
I was
and I
there
think
for
if somebody
meals.
had, beg your pardon?
I was there for meals.
Okay. The meals were pretty bad, as I remember, so I kind of stayed away and went elsewhere. But, I think if somebody had walked into my room like Lucy did, I would have been so grateful. It would have been great. And so for me, it was just but it was sort of a process of coming out gradually after that, after I got out of Williams, figuring out, meeting other people. So that's, it was much more of a gradual process. Moving to Portland. So Lucy, I've been dying to ask you where you went to high school. But basically
Wilson High School.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't live that far away from you. So my husband went to North Catholic, which burned down, and then to LaSalle. But basically, it's been sort of like osmosis. And so I know, just coming out at work, that sort of thing. and then and having my career, which Portland has been a wonderful place in that sense, because it is easier to be out in Portland and to feel comfortable here, I think, and maybe in some other parts of the country. In Williams, I always felt it was so small. I just felt sort of, it was like the little town I grew up in where everybody knew your business. So you sort of didn't let people know what was going on.
And
No,
no,
go ahead, Misha.
I just think that this is so relatable. Like every person that had an inkling of of who they were went to Williams thinking, okay, maybe I'll find someone, but like maybe it can be like our little secret, or who knows? You're looking for people. But this just reminds me of how being out is something that it's a personal journey. It happens when it happens, and we navigate that so many times in our lives. I think it was our EC member Elspeth who said that, like, in her takeover last June of the Eph alum Instagram, that we as queer people come out multiple times in our lives, almost like on the daily. Like, we're in a Zoom room now. Hi, I'm John, I'm gay. How did you navigate being out in the workplace? Were you able to be out in the workplace? This is a general question.
So for me, it took a while. When I was clerking, I was not out. Nobody was out when I was a law clerk. When I got to private practice, it was selective as to whom I told. And then when I started working for the Department of Justice, it just became very easy to be out, and it was such a pleasure to be publicly gay and not have to worry about it. And then after that, it was all done. And once I got a Wikipedia page, was on it, you didn't have to worry about being out.
To pick up on something that Dan said, which is the whole business of, do you have anything to lose? Because paradoxically, being an elite institution, people who attend an elite institution potentially have a lot to lose, like the wealthy classmates you referred to. So I was out at Williams. I was out at med school in San Francisco in 1978. And a lot of my classmates and friends thought I was very brave, but I think it wasn't courage at all. It was, what do I have to lose? If someone's going to judge me because of that, I don't really care about that. And I'm not expecting to be chair of the Department of Medicine or anything like that. I did want to mention that it was interesting going to San Francisco in 1978, because I expected, my med school was 6 blocks from the Summer of Love. I really expected that the San Franciscans would be, including my classmates, very sophisticated. And I was horrified to realize my classmates didn't know the difference between transgender, transvestite, and gay. So what I had thought were some perhaps limitations at Williams turned out to be present in this granola town I had gone to medical school in. But I think the business of what do we have to lose is really, really important, because there have been gay people who have said, well, everyone must be out. That's an ethical norm. But the reality is some of us have more options to make that safe than others. And it's very, very, I think, important we don't turn being out into a scorecard. One final remark is that my class of 78 had a panel very much like this, where we were talking about being gay at Williams and what that was like. And it was very interesting getting feedback from classmates who, as far as I know, are straight, because they basically said, oh, so you and John Martin, my classmate, were struggling with being authentic. Well, all of us were struggling with being authentic.
So I would like to continue a little bit along what Lisa was just talking about. I'm a retired pediatrician, so you can only imagine how complicated it would be to be an out pediatrician, with everything that people confuse pediatricians, pederasts, whatever. So literally the day I came out, I went to a gay bar with my cousin, having spent the afternoon at one of the bathhouses in San Francisco. That was my really out gay experience in San Francisco. Then we went to a gay bar where I ran into the head of my department. Okay, talk about a shit or go blind moment. That was it. I had already spent a month in San Francisco at my hospital doing an externship in the newborn ICU. So I was out literally the day before my internship started. Okay. So I couldn't go, there was no closet to go back into. And my only experience after that was when I was finishing my residency and I was looking for a job. I interviewed with a pediatrician down on the peninsula, and I thought it was a pretty good interview. And a day or so later, I get a phone call from his business manager, essentially asking me, was I gay? And at that point, I thought, wow, I'm not sure if this is even a question somebody could legally ask me. But I thought, okay, at that point, I knew I was. At that point, I was living with somebody. And I thought, wow, this is not for me. So again, and whether I came out further while I was in practice, I never specifically came out with my partners, nor did I discuss with them ever that I was HIV positive. So, you know, there are always secrets, I think, that we keep from other people for one reason or another. And that's just how life is. And it really sucks to have to keep those kind of secrets.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I'm thinking about, several of you have used the word authenticity and authentic. And I think nowadays we always talk about living our best lives and being open and free and living our authentic selves. And some of that, I think, comes for some of us with being able to identify with a particular label or with a particular term, right? So terminology, which varies in understanding and is constantly changing, is still sort of important to this, like being your authentic self, being able to name it for some people. And so that brings me to the idea that terminology has also changed, and terminology over time, right, takes on a different context. So the term queer, for example, certainly during the 60s and 70s had a very different meaning, was offensive, was derogatory. And now we have members of BiGLATA and other groups who identify as queer. The queer community, right? The group on campus is QSU, it's the Queer Student Union. And so I wonder if you all have sort of thoughts around that, if there's sort of a, you can compare sort of that experience of that word, that in the way that it's being lived out and how it's maybe being reclaimed, compared to how it was used maybe in your lives during that time, maybe even at Williams.
Sorry, unmute myself. I'd like to say something about that. I think it's really great y'all are doing this panel, because I think, I mentioned this earlier, we know generation to generation, we know so little about each other's experiences. And all the time, I mean, I sort of joke about this with friends. I hear young queer women saying, oh my God, when people started coming out in like the aughts, and, you know, I mean, there's a sense that every generation, we think we started it. I know we thought we started in the 70s. I have an aunt who came out in the 50s, you know, and had bars and had newsletters. So we don't know each other's histories. And I'm going to get to the queer thing, but one sort of thought about my generation, women who came out in the 70s, is that we're these completely humorless lesbians. Lesbians have no sense of humor. And that stereotype drives me crazy. I mean, I've never had more fun, more dying laughing, more humor than with my lesbian friends in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And I think it's basically a sexist stereotype that's used to shut people up. I mean, it's just not true. Lesbians, in my experience, have not been humorous. That gets me to queer. We called ourselves queer all the time. We thought it was hilarious. It wasn't offensive to me. It was a word we always used. We also had complete intersectional identity politics. That also isn't new. And I don't mean to say, I mean, I don't mean to say, oh, young people, you haven't said anything new, but I do want credit for generations and decades before where we were very aware of intersectional politics and identities. And we would embrace the word queer. When I was 18, we called ourselves queer. So it's not really that new. I don't know, Lisa, is that true? In your experience?
I actually latched on to queer much later. And part of what I like about it, it's inclusive.
Yeah.
And you have a wonderfully edgy, different, authentic person who might happen to be straight. I'm happy calling them queer too. So I like the inclusivity of it. But I also know that for some people, it's been this very damaging epithet. So it's a fascinating discussion. How do we take something that was used against us and own it without disrespecting the feelings of other people?
Yeah, I want to jump onto what Lisa just said. And as a result of several conversations I had over several years on campus, probably in the 2000s, I'm very comfortable identifying myself as queer, and I do it pretty publicly. And sometimes I do it, my friends think I do it more often than I need to. But I also do it because I think it is inclusive. And I think that's really important, because I think that from my perspective over the years, the gay community, until AIDS, was very exclusive. Gays and lesbians did not get together together often, and drag queens couldn't come to MCC churches, and there were all sorts of exclusivity, and that's what I like about. And I like about the fact that it isn't limited to sexuality. There's a lot of queer people in the world that I find that I'm perfectly happy loving as human beings. And I think it's important. And I also enjoy the fact that I have got several friends who, every time I use the word, it is the source of at least a 20-minute conversation by them how I shouldn't use it. So, which is fine. I continue to use it, and they continue to be gay. But it reminds me a little bit of my days in Key West when we had homosexuals in Key West. These were people in those days who were in their 70s and 80s, long since died, but they were homosexuals, and that's what they were in the 40s and 50s. And then we moved from homosexuals to gay, and as I say, I love queer. So I'm very happy with it.
I think it's the old tomato thing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a name, really. It's like, figuring out what pronoun you want to use. I mean, I went through all of this before there were these pronoun things to put after your name. It's just one more thing.
Yeah, and there are a lot of ways in which we can divide ourselves, but I think it's really beautiful when there are moments of intersectionality, because it reminds us that, like, if we're being rejected by a norm, you know, why not be open to like an inclusive plurality? Now, we did have some questions that were popped into the chat, so if you feel comfortable, we would love to ask them.
Dan's been very quiet and his microphone is off
Sorry, Dan?
or on.
Oh,
He's been very quiet.
oh, well, we will check in with him shortly. Scott Lankford, are you there? You know, you had a very long question, so I didn't know if you could maybe summarize it for you, or I'm more than happy to do my best.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Michelle, and thank you for hosting this, both of you. This is a wonderful opportunity. The short form of my question was that there was an amazing, and well, still is. Edward Stein was texting me in the chat privately. So Morris Kaplan was a 60s era Williams grad who went on to become a fantastic nationwide gay rights leader and philosophy professor, an early queer theorist who still teaches at SUNY. And I met him only once, quite accidentally, visiting Professor Nathaniel Lawrence's widow, Mary Lawrence, who they'd both been mentors of us both. So in this unforgettable living room conversation, he told me the history of ending the fraternity system at Williams College. And he told it in such a way that there was a kind of intersectionality, again, between his own Jewish American identity, his then closet identity, and the fact that the fraternities were originally challenged for blackballing people of color, right? And personally, in my experience, the number one reason I went to Williams was it didn't have fraternities. And I was just one of these 70s kids. I didn't believe in them. I think I'm still right. Apologies to those of you that were. So I wanted to hear more of that, maybe not now, but Edward Stein was already, I've got some emails going. I think there's a lost history of Williams College around queer rights, rights for people of color, anti-Semitism, and I think it's an ongoing conversation that needs to be had.
Agreed.
Yeah, well, I mean, yes.
I don't know if that's a question. It's more of an invitation. I'll put my email. I think what I'll do is I'll put my email. I've got a couple already coming in the chat.
Yeah.
But I also, those of you that are hosting, I'd like to see this conversation continued on that level, because I kind of feel like my experience of Williams was such that one of the reasons the conversation with Morris was so unforgettable is I had no idea that how pivotal the student leaders had been in ending the fraternity system. I had no idea that it was all about challenging segregation within the fraternity system and white supremacy within that system. I had no idea that some of the same students who led that movement went on to be queer rights leaders and queer theorists and so on and so forth. So I just feel like we could retell the history of Williams College in a way that would be really empowering to a current generation of students, as you see, speaking as a professor myself. So, who teaches LGBTQ lit, by the way, yay. And I was a total closet case at Williams. So Lisa, apologies for like never even saying half hi. Total gutless closet case. I so admire those of you that were able to come out in any way, shape, or form at Williams.
Well,
Didn't have to be till Stanford, and it was a complete night and day experience to come to California. Okay, and thank you.
Well, this just reminds me of the parallels between, like, I think Dan, you really did touch on this. The parallels between privilege and how it intersects with coming out. I believe Brian Watson had mentioned that there. Even just in this panel, you mentioned, Dan, you felt like you had nothing to lose, but I believe when we had our conversation, and also in your article, you mentioned that there was a student that apparently had taken their own life before, like, you might be able to articulate that better.
Yes. Pardon me. The background of my coming out included the fact that as a sophomore, I inadvertently fell in love with a straight senior. And I came close to suicide in the spring 1970 semester. That was during the time when Nixon invaded Cambodia and the Williams campus went on strike, and the semester came to an abrupt end. And so I was able to leave and return to Denver and start the process of coming out intellectually and politically. And so I went to New York City in the summer between my junior and senior years to join the Gay Activists Alliance and come out that way. And then I wanted to bring the message back to Williamstown, but I wasn't exactly sure how to do it. And so I happened to be the editor of the Williams Advocate. And so I was going to write an article about the history of being gay on campus. And I started interviewing prominent professors and members of the administration of the college about what they could tell me. And bottom line, I didn't learn very much from them. They had nothing to share. And so I finally decided that I was the expert. And so I sat down and interviewed myself. But in that process, Fred Rudolph, who was a history professor, distinguished history professor, and I also was an American civilization major. There's so many commonalities among us here. He told me about Danny Johnson, Fred did.
My class.
Who, as Fred shared with me, hanged himself in the basement of West College in the spring semester of 1968, the semester before I arrived there. And how that was really a commentary about how dire the circumstance could be for an emerging gay student on campus, that there was no place to have solace or consultation or what have you. And so that even when Fred told me that story, that steeled my resolve even more to come out publicly to at least try to initiate some sort of public conversation of the issue and try to avoid Danny Johnson's, as I had been almost had been a year or two before. So that's that story in a very quick nutshell.
I mean, he was a classmate of mine, and I don't think I was even aware of it at the time that it had occurred in the basement of the building in which I was living. That was how, not on gaydar I was about anything, or even about other members of my class who might have been. Other than what I remember most about Danny Johnson is that he probably was the most out appearing person in our class. So even if you didn't know, you just thought. And that somehow he was not the person I wanted to be associated with. Again, that's how much my perspective has changed since I've been out. And again, also living in San Francisco. It's like there is so much about you that is publicly known, and there's other parts about you that you do just want to keep to yourself.
This brings up for me the whole question of straight allies, both then and now, and how incredibly important that is, especially in a place like Williams that I think of as kind of a fishbowl community. When we started the Gay Student Union and started publishing the Lavender Albatross, someone in Mission Park, at the Mission Park dining hall, quieted the entire dining hall, stood up on a table and read one of our articles in a lisp and in what he considered a stereotyped gay man's voice. And the entire dining hall, I was sitting there with my girlfriend and had to listen to this. And my cousin, Beth Wyman, and her boyfriend at the time, Mark Leach, were both at Williams, and they're now married. And Mark Leach, a straight man, stood up. I get choked up every time I think of this, and it really is one of the ways that I survived a place like Williams. Mark Leach stood up and told him to shut up and sit down. And that was so powerful for me as a little 18-year-old kid sitting there listening to this guy mock, our newsletter and this thing we had written. And the guy shut up and sit down. And so I would like people to know how powerful something, it was so courageous of Mark to do that in 1976, I think, as a straight man, and but how powerful a simple act like that can be.
And this also reminds me of the importance of adequate mental health and support for our students. And that's definitely something that I think we all want to make sure is something that is available for current now. Did any of you at all use any of the services available at Williams? Was that even a thing?
No, there really wasn't much there. I mean, the health services, I don't even know where it was, but it wasn't much of anything. And again, having grown up in Pittsfield, I knew if I needed to have something done, I could probably just go there. But I don't think there was anything, at least that I was aware of, going on for anybody who might have had psychological problems. I don't think anybody ever talked about those. Certainly not amongst ourselves, or that, you know, you would have had to figure out who to go to or where to go to get that kind of help. I don't think those didn't seem to be issues at all while I was in school there.
It sounds like there was more of relying on, like Lucy said, maybe allies or someone who you knew, whether they were straight or not, right? To sort of support you out loud, and also just in private in some ways, to kind of hold you sort of, you know, in a safe space, right? I mean, it really was about safety. We've talked about this too a little bit, about creating safe spaces, feeling safe. And now sometimes we talk about creating a brave space, but really I think at that point it was safety. And, you know, and who can help me create a safe space and be as safe as possible.
You know, I think looking back on the way things were then and the way things are there now, it seems like, at least from what I can glean from all of this involvement that I've had, and it basically started after my 50th reunion when I went back, and I had only been to my 25th reunion, which was wonderful. But that reunion basically coincided with telling my parents that I was HIV positive. And I had dreaded over the 6-hour flight from San Francisco how that was going to go. And I left them with that information, and then I went off to my reunion. But basically was, you know, still relatively in the closet with the rest of my classmates. And basically, I didn't come out to the rest of my Williams classmates until my 50th reunion. And then it was partly because the essay that I had written for the alumni issue got lost in the ether somewhere. So I had to recreate it individually, person by person. And it was wonderful to do. And at that point, it was like, I didn't have anything to lose, you know? Much like Dan said, at a certain point, I mean, it isn't a question of feeling brave. It's just you're no longer in that environment, of that environment. So it happens when it happens, I guess.
A quick lighthearted story. I went to my 5th reunion with great ambivalence. I went with 2 gay guys, and we all were living in Manhattan at the time. And we vowed that if we weren't having a good time, we'd just hop back in the car and drive back to Manhattan. So Friday night for the reunion weekend, people were nominated for class president. Someone nominated me. And then there were about 9 other, what you might consider preppy type people. Well, lo and behold, I won. Because, as I like to say, all the weirdos voted for me, including all the straight queer people. And it was very bizarre because it isn't certainly anything I wanted or expected. And I'm very, very sure there were some unhappy people, but it was a fun experience.
Well, this sort of brings me to what what unfortunately is going to hopefully wrap up, but endow our conversation with some strength toward the future. You know, obviously we have some people here in various parts of their journeys, maybe at the beginning, but also allies. What advice would you give to a current student?
Be yourself.
Do whatever you want to do when you can do it, because waiting until maybe you retire is too late. Nobody ever expected this pandemic to hit, okay? So everybody who is waiting for whatever to be able to travel and do what you can do, you never know what tomorrow's going to bring. So if you want to be a doctor, you don't have to major in science. Learn everything that the college affords you that is not science. It helps. It really helps. And otherwise, just do it now. That's my advice.
Mine would be surround yourself with people who love and respect you, and do the same to others.
I would be very supportive of what Lisa just said. She speaks my piece.
And trust yourself. I feel like it's hard not to say cliches, but they're true. I mean, we all doubt ourselves, and I think maybe queer people doubt ourselves more and for longer than some people. But trust that you do know the answers and the truth, and just go for it, because we have so little time on this planet.
So for all giving advice, I'll wrap up with this one. I mean, I think it's that you're not alone. I always used to think I was the only person who felt like I did. And looking back, I realized there were a lot of people in my situation, whether it was orientation, academics, whatever. But there are a lot of people who have the same doubts, the same fears, and you just have to overcome them one way or another. But there are people out there that are in the same, that you could find, make common cause with.
And maybe I could throw in to reflect on the last two comments, that when we are afraid or fearful or suffering, we often think that's what makes us unique, but our banged up and vulnerable places are what we have most in common with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we are not alone, and it's so cool to hear some of these stories and to really connect the dots between all of the different initiatives that have led to literally us sitting here right now. I still have to say that my jaw dropped when I heard that Middlebury still is setting up their BiGLATA. And I'm so happy that we have what we have, and I think that there's plenty of ways to make it better. On that note, I do want to say that we are going to be continuing this series into the 80s and the 90s and the aughts and the 10s. And that this panel is not an exhaustive list of people who come from this time. And these are amazing people. So, you know, we hope to bring us more together, and if you're curious about them, look them up, ask them some questions, connect, as we are Ephs. But also, please, if you are interested in being a panelist, just drop that into the chat. You can fill out that form, and no promises, but as we are putting together future panels, hopefully we can reach out to you. If not for this specific series, also for some sort of future thing, as you know, conversations will continue.
Yeah, and so thank you all so much for attending. Thank you for kind of creating the connective tissue that has been missing for so long, right? Especially for alumni in this part of Williams's sort of existence. And so an extra special thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much for being here, for sharing your stories, for just for being here, and for bringing this presence and these stories and all of that to us and to new generations and to our fellow Eves. Again, stay tuned. As Mijan said, we have more installments in this series. There's more to come. 1980s and 1990s are coming up. And so feel free to reach out to any BiGLATA member as well. If you have ideas, thoughts, comments, jokes, limericks, etc. We're open to all of it. So we're just, thank you so much, everyone.
And thanks to BiGLATA for doing this tonight.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This was terrific. Terrific.
Thank you, QSU.
Yeah,
Thank you all around.
you.
Yay. Oh, Avery, you wanted to say something? Can't. Avery, one of the co-chairs of QSU, wanted to say something. If we can unmute.
Hi there. Wow, that was a panicked 5 seconds in which I tried to pose a statement and then realized I could not say anything. I guess very shortly, for current students who are here, thank you for attending. We have our newsletter sign up on our Instagram. There's tons of ways you could sign up. For the alumni who spoke, thank you so much. Thank you for elucidating this history. In particular, thank you, Ms. Capaldini and Ms. Bledsoe, because I think what the QSU is now is a continuation of what you founded, to my knowledge. Documentation is very sparse. Also, in general, as I've said in chat, I've also gotten like several dozen texts about how people think you're like awesomely cool. That's just a thing. I don't really know. Just in general, thank you for this. This is important to the roughly over 300 openly queer students who are currently on the Williams campus.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
Mind blown. Mind blown.
What?
Times have changed.
Yeah,
They have.
it's a beautiful thing.
I think that one of the things that I've really enjoyed from some of the events that we've had and meeting Avery and hearing about the QSU was literally like that number, that like there are in the hundreds of people who are out, or who are, or even if they're allies, but like just people who are open enough to do that. And I think that that is part of the evolution of who we are.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Amazing.
I mean, I guess times haven't really changed in terms of, I was checking the list to see if anyone from administration was here, so I'm able to say this. Clearly, they haven't been able to stop the keggers and sage for a good several decades, but some of those people are gay now, so maybe it's not so bad.
Well, gay people drink beer, just like straight people. Beer is beer.
That is an argument I've had multiple times in this campus. Before I embarrass myself, I'll just stop talking.
Well, thank you, everyone. And we will be hopefully getting together very soon.
Yes, come back for the next iteration. Please join us. Thank you all so much.
All right.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.